You can now find me on Roadster, the app connecting people through cars.
Hello everybody. For a very long time, Britain has had one of the best used car markets in the world. Not only do we get a fairly wide variety of models here, but our insatiable desire to always have the latest and the greatest means that we treat cars as a far more disposable asset than we ought to. The net result of that is that for a long time there have been a huge number of cars in the classifieds available at bargain prices. However, over the last decade and a bit, an awful lot has changed. We've had the scrappage scheme, we've had rising fuel prices, we've had the introduction of congestion and low pollution zones in many cities. Diesel, which was the fuel of choice for a very long time, has now fallen massively out of favour, and there seems to be a great push towards all electric. Whilst some of that you'd think would only push used car prices down, for a long time it did. However, it then got to a point where so many cars were so cheap they were simply uneconomical to keep going. Numbers dropped rapidly, and now as a result of basic supply and demand, prices are rising once again. The last time we had a major recession, many of the world's wealthy poured their money into cars because they seem to be one of the few appreciating assets. Here in Britain, you don't actually pay any tax either if you make money on a car. So it's a very lucrative thing if you get it right. Extremely limited supply of new cars has also paused the depreciation of fairly recently built stuff, and in some cases actually reversed it. So you'll now pay overs for a car which is actually 18 months old. Only 5 years ago, £1,000 in your back pocket and you could pick up a pretty decent example of an older car with an MOT on it that you could probably use and enjoy for quite a bit. But those days are nearly over. And now, a quick browse through Car and Classic will tell you that for even the ropiest old car, you could be paying quite a bit. And some of these are things that only a few years ago you wouldn't have even given £500 for, and now they're commanding thousands. But that doesn't mean bargains aren't still out there, and if you're brave, there are some incredible cars available at bargain basement prices, such as this. And this car demonstrates perfectly the absolute ludicrousness of the current British used car market, because what we have here is the absolute top of the Mercedes tree from only 24 years ago. This is a 1998 Mercedes CL600. Yes, I know there were a few models above this, AMG ones, including the extraordinarily rare and lesser spotted CL73. This car actually went by a number of different names during its lifetime. It was in production for more or less the entirety of the 90s and is a spin-off of the W140 S Class, regarded by many as the last properly engineered Merc before the accountants took over. The earliest version of this car, like the saloon, was referred to as the 600 SEC. This later then became the S600 Coupe and finally the CL600. With those name changes came some other upgrades and tweaks, and it's generally regarded that the last few years of production were probably the best. Such was the cost of building a car as well engineered as this. At the time, you'd have had to have parted with £107,000 to get your hands on one. These days, that equates to just shy of 200 grand. This was not a cheap car, and happily, from in here, it doesn't feel it at all. In fact, from the outside, it also looks like a pretty handsome thing too. It's big, as you might expect, at about 5 meters long, although compared to some other stuff on the roads now, it's not gargantuan. These later cars also have parking sensors at the back, rather than the comedy extending poles of the earlier ones, which were frankly entirely useless. To be entirely honest with you, this is the kind of car I'm just not sure where to begin with. I suppose we'll start at the front and talk about that engine, because that's going to be the draw for a lot of people, mostly because it's famously also the engine used in the Pagani Zonda, though the Zonda version wasn't the same for very long. Its codename is M120. It's 6 litres, 12 cylinders and 48 valves of German perfection. the power figure is relatively modest at 408 horses. Torque similarly not huge at 420 pound-feet. The truly gargantuan torque figures came with the later S Class because they eventually switched to turbocharging. This always naturally aspirated. In fact, the smallest engine you could have for this was a 4 and a bit litre V8, with the mainstay of the range being a 5 litre. The saloon had a lot more engines available to it, but for the coupe, they simply didn't bother. The overall concept of the car is already a bit of a strange one, because the idea of an S-Class is to be large, luxurious executive transport, essentially a shrunken down limousine, and it's for the person who's not necessarily going to be sat up front. This is an ever so slightly smaller, sleeker coupe, which has much more limited room in the back, yet can still carry 4 adults just about. However, it's not considerably more sporty than the regular car. What it is, though, is absolutely spectacular. A car like this I'd be tempted to describe using the word majestic, but that I don't think is an accurate fit for the big CL. Instead, I think the best way to describe this car is imperious. You get this sensation that below the surface an awful lot is going on in order to make things seem quite this calm. I get the feeling the same thing happens at many a palace all around the world. This sense of serenity, balance and delicacy is all provided by a team of very skilled people working very hard around the clock, and you get that sort of sensation here. Truth be told, I hadn't actually realised that it was this generation of S Class Coupe that its owner Christian was bringing to me, because when he told me how much he paid, less than £3,000, I automatically assumed it must have been one of the later W215 cars, based on the generally unloved W220 S Class. I'm actually quite fond of that generation car, and it feels really night and day different to this. The newer car is actually quite a bit smaller and lighter, which for this category is generally unheard of. It took a very long time before Mercedes once again built a car the same size as this. Construction here is still largely steel, meaning the curb weight is well over 2 tons. For the top models like this, closer to about 2.2, which means that big engine does have its work cut out. As you might expect, it's connected to an automatic gearbox. Earlier, they were available with a 4-speed, and later a 5 came in. The 5 doesn't seem to have as good a reputation for durability as the 4, which is generally seen as bomb-proof. However, a little bit of investigation suggests that that may be because Mercedes didn't give any servicing instructions at all for the 5-speed, and it's not something that can go forever without needing a bit of help, so if you are going to be buying one of these, that's certainly something you need to look into. And let's not beat about the bush here. You know as well as I do that the purchase of one of these is probably going to be the cheapest part of the entire experience. There is nothing about a top-flight 24-year-old V12 Mercedes that was ever designed with being cost-conscious in mind. If you want to own a car a little bit like this on a much more affordable budget, check out the old W124 E-Class. That being said, for the brave, there's an awful lot of reasons why you might want to chance something like this. First off, the way it goes down a road is just sensational. No, it's not particularly quick. You will reach its limits fairly soon. Today is not really the day to test this car's overall dynamic limits, but you can tell you're probably not that far away from them most of the time. The brakes are a definite weakness. The steering is better than you might expect. It weights up a little bit more than you tend to get in a car of this class. And although off-centre is a little bit slow to respond, once you're in the corner and the car's loaded up, it's actually quite pleasant. If you are the sort of person easily scared off by relatively high running costs, this is definitely not the car for you. A lot of people will cite the fuel costs as a big concern for a car like this, but the truth is, that's the least of your worries. Fuel cost is a fairly predictable expense. It's all the rest of it you need to watch out for. And because these cars have languished for so long at knockdown prices, many have gone some considerable time without proper maintenance. And they do need proper maintenance. Wonder what the turning circle's like. Actually, not that bad for a big old bus. Manoeuvring, actually, not that bad. Because it's all squared off, you kind of know where all of it is. As a naturally aspirated quad cam item, if you want the best from the engine, you really do have to rev it, and the gearbox is quite reluctant to do that. However, you can take over manually, not that it always pays much attention to your requests. And there is, for the last couple thousand RPM, a real sense of urgency. Most of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the car that F-Spot bought and then put his famous, very expensive exhaust on, turning it into something that sounded more like an F1 car than a luxury saloon. But by default, at anything under about $3.5 grand, what you mostly get is the sound of distant mechanical whirring, and from outside what you hear is the sound of the air being punched out of the way and then dragged back in by that massive engine. Despite having no fewer than 7 ECUs of its own, the engine is actually not a point of concern on these cars, or at least doesn't seem to be. Gearboxes likewise, if well maintained, are fairly decent, but it's just everything else you need to watch out for. Suspension components, bushings, engine mounts, gearbox mounts, these are all things that will take a hammering on any large luxurious car, and this is no exception. I'm told that this car is fitted with Mercedes self-leveling suspension, a fluid-based system that more or less does the same as air ride, and it's actually reasonably durable. By default, this generation CL rode on fairly conventional dampers and springs. Those are known to crack, but not an item of particular concern. Though these are not immune to corrosion, overall they seem far better than the model that replaced them. But the killer here is the electrical system, and this particular car currently demonstrates a few such problems. This driver's seat isn't working. It thinks that it's 58 degrees outside, and over here somewhere there's a small fan with a bearing I think that's gone because it's making an awful racket. The saddest thing about a car like this is that if the previous owners had simply kept on top of the maintenance, fixed things as they broke, to own something like this wouldn't actually be all that awful. What you get though is people that let the car keep breaking and keep breaking and keep breaking, so long as it doesn't break in a catastrophic way, and then when you get somebody who does want the car to be fully working, to get it there is going to cost a fortune. Even with used car prices at an all-time high, if you were to buy one of these and try and fix it up without losing your shirt, that's going to be reasonably difficult. That's not the same though as saying it isn't worth it. I'm sure those of you who've watched the channel for a while will know that I am somebody who believes in trying to take good care of a car, and I never expect the return from a car to be purely financial. If you are the sort of person that you want something that gives you that kind of Rolls-Royce vibe, but is actually still going to be a lot cheaper to run than an old Rolls, one of these is going to be a very, very good shout. Although I've never been a particular Merc fan, I have to say there is something just inherently desperately cool about these cars. There just is. The sheer concept of it made it something already very much out there. The only car that even springs to mind as being close to this is probably the old Jaguar XJC. I gotta confess actually, when you do put your foot down, if it decides to change gear properly, it isn't slow, this thing. It really isn't. The paper figures may not impress, but it does not feel plenty quick enough, I can tell you. This chassis doesn't need any more power than this. The brakes I don't think are actually that terrible. Not great pedal feel, but you can tell they've got an awful lot to try and slow down. You may also be wondering how it is that a 20-year-old can even afford to insure a car like this. Well, Christian is a car design student, and in his spare time, like a few of the people that I've met, he buys and sells cars, so has motor trade insurance. In truth, that's about the only way I can think that anyone of that age would be able to get a quote on a car like this, let alone be able to afford it. Also, please don't think the low purchase price means that's what the car is worth. It was bought at auction and he's already spent a considerable amount on it, trying to fix a number of items. He tended to many of the cosmetics, has done work on the brakes, and is continuing to fix what he can. This is not going to be sold on as a mint car. It will instead be more of a fairly friendly project because, as you can see, it's still a car you can very much drive, enjoy and use. Just not everything in here works. The seatbelt butler does though, and this car is packed with technology that even now isn't a given on top flight cars. So I remember this generation of S-Class very well. It featured on an old Clarkson VHS. This was the first time I realised soft closed doors were a thing. This car has not only that, it's also got climate control, the fully electric seats, so there's lumbar support in them, and you have the thickest double glazing I've ever seen in a car. I am sure there's an awful lot more about this generation of CL that still could be said, and I've either forgotten or never knew. And so for that reason, I would invite anybody who's got some interesting facts about it to pop into the comment section below and share them with us all. Likewise, if you have any tips on things to look out for when buying one of these, or easy fixes for common issues, please do share that information. It's very, very helpful. Anyway, that I think is enough from me for now. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.